Absolutely, and I think we heard that message a few times today that it is. It's not just about. I mean, Kyle, I completely agree with you. It's not about us here, the Indigenous scholars here and now. It's about those youth coming up behind us already. So, really fantastic presentations. I just can't thank all of you enough. We somehow have only 15 minutes left for questions, but really happy to take them. I have a couple in order that I'd like to ask, and I think some of the panelists are also interested in sort of answering, but I just wanted to also point out that today at the University of Lethbridge, they made history by having the university sign on to the Buffalo Treaty as well. So this is something big that's gaining a ton of momentum, and it's just important to so many people. I actually have two questions here that I'm going to read out for everyone on the panel to certainly offer their thoughts if they feel they want to, although I'm not going to direct them towards a certain person. But so the first question is a big thank you, and that the person has learned so much today. And they're asking, do you think there is an opportunity for Indigenous communities on the prairies to integrate beef cattle, given their many similarities to bison, as a means to enhance the health of temperate grasslands? And so what this person says is, I'm only meaning this from a biological perspective because they certainly recognize that it's not a stand-in for the spiritual significance of bison to many Indigenous peoples. So kind of like to, and I see Dan is poised to answer this one, which is not a big surprise to me, but I also want to read out the second question here because we get this one a lot, and it's the reason I bring up the Buffalo Treaty as well. Second question says, please elaborate on the reintroduction of bison species and where do they go on the landscape? And we hear this quite a bit. So while other panelists are thinking, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's got his mic open already.
So that will be up to Indigenous communities to decide themselves. I think I just sent a link to you. So this is a research down in the, did you get it? Well, hopefully it went to you. I answered the question and hopefully you got it. But it'll be up to communities. So this research that I just sent you is from the States, and it's 30 years, and it shows that that cows can be a good, it can help with biodiversity. Bison are much better with biodiversity. They actually help prairie habitats twice as well as cattle. But cattle are not necessarily a negative, so they can be a little bit of a positive used in the right circumstances, what this research shows. And they actually had the bison and the cows side by side in different pens, and so it was a rigorous study, I guess, for lack of a better word. I could talk bison forever, and I think there's other questions. So can someone confirm that actually went out, that link?
Yeah, that went out, so anyone will be able to see that in the answered questions. And then, yeah, no, I'd love to turn it over to someone else on the panel. And I think the question about where do bison go on the landscape is kind of related to the fact that a lot of the landscape in some places is quite developed, and I think folks have difficulty sort of imagining what it would look like to allow bison to either roam free on the landscape or what it would look like if they were all confined. So I don't know if someone wants to comment on that as well, or just in general, but.
Maybe if I could comment on the first one, and I think it's, I had the benefit of growing up, spending a lot of my summers growing up in the United States. And there, to some extent, the Indigenous agriculture, but kind of just in the conventional sense of agriculture, is a lot more popular, or a lot more well-funded, I suppose. And there already you start to see people become attached to their cattle just as much as a community might potentially be attached to their bison population. And I think this is one of the keys for any aspect of agriculture, right? Bison versus cow, yes, okay, there's one species is native, one is not. Yes, okay, I totally understand the biological perspective, but I think, new technologies, right? New technologies that maybe none of us have ever used, whether we're Indigenous or not, doesn't necessarily make it a Western or make it something different, right? It's how we incorporate these things into our land practices and those values that we highlight in terms of evaluating whether we want this practice or want to do this type of science or want to integrate this type of technology. And that's what you see in the US. A lot of communities they have their entire land management plan, their ceremonies really well integrated with bison, right? A lot of them use bison skin, right? Instead of nice buffalo capes. There's a lot of traditional ceremonies associated with cow skulls and these elements, and even the Indian rodeo scene, right? There's this, especially out in the Southwest and the West, the Indian rodeo scene where indigenous groups and tribes are breeding their own bulls for rodeo, and they're treating this as a industry that belongs to them. So these species are becoming as indigenous as those initial horses were when they first escaped from all the Spanish conquistadors and Spanish settlers in the 1600s.
Mhm.
I could speak to both points, if I may. As you saw in our video, we have cow-calf operations on reserve today. And we, I believe, have always had cow-calf operations on Mistawasis going back to the time of our grandfathers. We, like most First Nations, including Muskeg, we have marginal land within our reserve base. Also, it was mentioned or shown that we lost about 40–45% of our land base. That was the top quality soil through different compensation agreements with the federal government for that lost land. We are buying land today. Of course, we are buying land that is of grain production potential, but also buying land for cattle operations. So we have our historical land base, plus we're buying additional lands for cow-calf operations. When we talk about the bison or the buffalo, the plains bison once were from Mexico to central Saskatchewan, north central Saskatchewan, to the Rocky Mountains. Throughout that traditional range, there are small herds scattered throughout, from Mexico to Prince Albert Park to Banff. And quite often these herds are in national parks, but they're also on First Nation lands. And again, as I mentioned, we have plans to return bison home to Mistawasis on Mistawasis lands. These herds are, for the most part, disease-free and as pure as possible. Of course, there are domesticated herds and have been, buffalo have been crossbred with cattle for over 100 years. So the purity of the buffalo is of concern to us. And so when Mistawasis acquires buffalo, we will get it from some of these conserved and protected areas like national parks, where the herds are pure. And but at the same time, there are domesticated herds. So when we bring buffalo back to Mistawasis lands, we might have those two thoughts. Because of the value of buffalo, we might look at that commercial value and maybe want that commercial herd. But at the same time, for the other values that we attach to the buffalo beyond the dollar bill, we may want a smaller herd that we just let them be buffalo on Mistawasis lands. So I'm not too sure if I answered the question, but I hope I provided our view or our approach to both beef and bison.
If I could just add to that, Emily, you commented, yes, of course, much of the prairies has been developed and fragmented, and our reserves are small, right? So there is only so much land available, but that's not to say, as Anthony mentioned, our traditional territories have been thousands of hectares. And so there's land that, so any kind of rematriation of buffalo has to be not just First Nations, but it has to be, everybody. And, we have agricultural crown land that is being sold off. That land, it's not reserve land because it's already been expropriated, over 100 years ago. But it's still land that has the potential. And through, partnerships and through, maybe initiatives like the Buffalo Treaty, perhaps there can be, using these lands that do exist, that have been pasture, there's a lot of potential there.
At one time, there were estimates that for the plains bison, there were between 30 and 60 million across the Great Plains of what we now call North America. Of course, we realize it's the 21st century. We can't return to that.
Great perspectives. Thanks so much. I'm being asked to remind everyone that we've got about 5 minutes left. I have so many great questions. There's one that we did promise to get back to, so I'm just going to get to that one right now, and it is International Women's Day, so I think it's a great question. But so Dan, you had said that Métis women are big players, and someone had asked you to expand on that a little bit, which you did. And they also want you to touch on what you'd said in your answer in the text a little bit. I just thought I'd bring it into the I thought I'd just bring it into the conversation here. But you sort of mentioned that out east, sometimes the case can be a little different. So just wanted you to expand on that, please.
Yeah, I think all three presenters or four presenters here today talked about the role of women and Indigenous communities being matriarchal societies, and actually being much more active in decision making and running farms in the case of the Métis. There's evidence. Nice that there's some written evidence here. Well, there's traditional knowledge, and then there's also things that were written down by the Hudson's Bay Company. And so we know that a good chunk of the Red River settlement title, the lands, were actually held in women's names. And that's partly because husbands die. That's partly because they're single women, and there's lots of cases where multiple women in the same family get together and they run a farm together. And children play a big role in this. And so it's not a man's world, I guess, in the case of Red River agriculture. And when I was speaking to, so they had to enact poverty laws, to the British did, and the Americans. And so that's what I'm referring to. It is in the Dr. Norma Hall's research, where she actually cites some of those places. But essentially, women could, out east in the United States and probably even Canada, back in the day, women couldn't protect their children if they got into a tight position, as far as losing their husband, and then there would be debts, and then because there used to be debtors' prisons, like, let's be frank, right? And so in the out west, where Canada and the Empire hadn't yet established itself before Canadian law and before British law, there was no poverty laws. There was no poor houses where you would go to jail if you didn't pay your debts and everything. And so women that lost their husbands and had struggled to pay the bills would be supported by the community. And in traditional societies, you don't let anybody falter. Everybody, you share and you support and everything else. So that's what I was referring to, is these laws didn't apply applied out east, but they didn't apply out west.
Well, thanks for that clarification. And I see so many other good questions, and I'm being told that we can actually continue the conversation if we'd like in the next session as well. But I would love to ask Anthony and Melissa this question that came in kind of towards the end, and they are wondering, what does it look to be ready for the buffalo to come back?
If I may just make one comment first, as a follow-up to Dan's statement or words. Our teachings come from land, water, sky. In a herd of buffalo, it's the female that leads the herd. So just to follow up to Daniel's comment. When are we ready? This is, when are we ready to bring back the buffalo? Is that the question?
Well, I think you'd said, are we ready? And you said, I'm not sure. And so the person's asking, what would it look like to be ready? How will you know? What do you think you're looking for?
Of course, everything is a work in progress. A work in progress that has been happening for a number of generations. Very recently, and again, as I mentioned, we have our bridge to land, water, sky. We have had other collaborations on landscape, climate, environmental matters for a number of years. Partnerships have included the university, various NGOs, local, provincial, national, in some cases, international NGOs that we work with. Mistawasis is signatory to the Buffalo Treaty. We first learned about it 1 year after it was created in 2015. We went to the second anniversary. We could have signed the Buffalo Treaty right away, but we wanted to bring that idea home to Mistawasis and think about it and talk about it. Rather than simply signing a piece of paper, we wanted to be true to the treaty. We wanted to be true to the buffalo. So the partnerships that we've had for a number of years, for me, the buffalo is always in the back of my mind. So when we partner with organizations on flooding issues, climate change, I look to that partner to see how they might support the return of buffalo to Mistawasis lands. For me, I think we're very close to being ready. We've already had discussions started to have discussions about Mistawasis lands that might be suitable for buffalo. For me, the next step, again, we have a 4-year buffalo trace project with Parks Canada to study, to learn from the herd in PA National Park. But also we're quite aware of these different herds throughout North America. When we're ready to bring buffalo to Mistawasis lands, we could get a small herd from one location, but I'm thinking it might be wise to get a handful of buffalo from different locations to bring to Mistawasis. And I believe they'll be ready very soon. So we've made all those connections. That includes other First Nations, signatories to the Buffalo Treaty, but also other First Nations that have recently acquired buffalo. So we want to learn from them as well. And that's part of the idea behind the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky, is that we learn from one another, because we all have the same hope for a good future. And the same is true with the buffalo. Many of us, especially Indigenous people, want to bring back the buffalo to the landscape. The Great Plains of North America, there were many people, many tribes, many nations that lived with and followed the buffalo. So for Mistawasis Nehiyawak, The buffalo defined who we were as a people and as a nation. Now in the 21st century, as we move towards truer self-determination, truer self-government, we need the buffalo beside us. When we define ourselves as people, nations in the 21st century, as Plains people, we need the buffalo beside us. So apart from all the other reasons for having buffalo, there's these types of reasons as well. The buffalo defines who we are as Plains people, even in the 21st century.
Well, thanks so much for that answer. I got a quick message from Dan that he had to leave, so that's why he hopped off really quickly. I don't want to be disrespectful of people's time. I don't know, Kyle, Anthony, Melissa, if you have time for another question, or if your time is, if you're done with time, you're shrugging, I'm seeing shrugs. Okay. We'll do one more, we'll do at least one more. Okay, because I would like to hear about the bundles of BMPs. And then I think, you know, Kyle will probably have some thoughts on those as well, but maybe if you could let us know what those are, I think that's quite intriguing.
Sure. Yeah, this came about after lots of back and forth and conversations and thinking about, you know, because a living lab is meant to, you know, sort of operate on a real farm scale or real landscape scale. You know, a single intervention, especially within a really short period of time, you know, the impact might be quite minor or maybe not at all. And so one of the things that we've sort of conceptualized is sort of this notion of like not doing just one thing, sort of bundle BMPs. And so we came up with 3 categories basically. So the first one being around crop diversification. So does that mean potentially including cover crops or some sort of intercropping system? Does that include just diversifying the rotation itself by including, you know, by extending that rotation, including, you know, additional crop species than what is currently there? So this notion of crop diversification is one bundle. The second bundle is related to input reduction and trying to increase input use efficiency. So largely, again, because this is a climate change sort of directed project, you know, nitrogen fertilization is one of those key pieces that we're looking at, but we're also looking at other inputs, you know, including herbicides, fungicides, you know, and other pesticides. So input reduction is the other bundle. And then the third bundle has to do with landscape diversification. So looking at, you know, as an example, perennialization of marginal parts of the field landscape, right? So maybe taking out 10% of that field and rather than annually cropping it, perhaps, you know, again, planting grasses, or again, doing, you know, potentially restoring wetland or buffers around wetlands. So those are the 3 bundles. And of course, you know, the Living Lab is meant to be co-developing any of these practices. So we sort of had this idea of, okay, why don't we approach this by combining sort of these different categories, but the sort of the details of what that might look like, you know, that's where the co-development piece happens. And so we don't know, you know, we're not going to be prescriptive about that. So we don't necessarily know exactly, you know, what are the combinations that are going to be trialed. That will be the work ahead of us in the next, certainly in the next year. And then hopefully next year, actually doing some implementation and actually trialing and looking and monitoring to see what the impacts might be.
If I could just continue, I'll just add one comment to when are we ready for the buffalo. When the kids tell us we want buffalo, then we'll be ready.
That makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. I thought I still need it there. And it's kind of reminds me of Kyle's like language map of like, you know, maybe this is a way that we can think of where, you know, culture is really starting to be, I don't want to say revitalized. Like, I don't want to make it sound like our cultures are not, you know, vibrant, but you know, that it can be an indicator of that kind of thing. And I think that's sort of what we're all looking for, is that cultural engagement as well as that hope. So, so I've taken us way over time. I'm told there's another session that we're all welcome to join and continue chatting in, or, you know, if folks need to go, they can certainly go. But I know that I've taken us over time today, and it's just been such an incredible panel. I did want to ask if folks had closing words, and I know I haven't directed a question specifically at Kyle today, and so no, you don't have. He's like, nah, I don't have any closing words. Well, there is a question in the chat about potentially, you know, doing some knowledge transfer, or also, you know, helping out with some communities in northern Manitoba that are having trouble leasing out lands that they've just acquired back to other farmers. And so what can they do to, you know, get more involved? So maybe we'll get you two linked up in the next session if you're able to hop over, but if you're not, that's no problem. So so thank you again so much to the panel. Thanks to Dan, who had to leave, and of course, thanks to everyone who was here to listen today. You know, I hope that you can take some of what, you know, you heard today and maybe just like reflect on that, and just, there's so much that we can accomplish together, but you know, we kind of need to be understanding where each other are coming from. So I hope today got us a little bit closer to that place, and building those bridges. So I think with that, just a huge thank you to the organizing committee as well. I'm told that in the chat, which I cannot see myself, there may be a link to the next session. But miigwech to all, thank you again, and take care.